As soon as there's a mummy, I'm leaving. Well, don't worry, Rick. I know how to defeat mummies. I know how. I have found the way to make the mummies fear me. The only thing that they fear is me, Rick. Today we're going to try something that's usually extremely ill-advised. A review of a nostalgia-inducing childhood game and trying to give an honest take on its positives and negatives. Probably peeking behind the creator's curtain a bit too much, but back when I was 11, I picked up the NES Classic port of Castlevania for the Game Boy Advance. Now, that thing occupied a massive amount of my time outside of school for a while. Ever since then, I've dumped a lot of time into running and rerunning the game. It just struck all the right chords for me, I guess. A classic horror setup, tough as nails platforming, and a rock-solid pace, which you can blaze through once you get a handle on the game. Good luck getting to that point, however. A lot of people go back to the first Castlevania, however, and they come back with a less than stellar impression of it. So, to get into that Halloween spirit, let's look back at Castlevania 1 to give it a real honest appraisal. On the surface, Castlevania is a big love letter to Hammer horror creature features. You have Dracula, Frankenstein, mummies, the whole monster squad is here. It obviously doesn't stop there, as Castlevania carries over the brighter color palettes from those films and follows a badass vampire hunting hero. Instead of Peter Cushing running around, however, Castlevania stars Conan the Barbarian with an Indiana Jones bullwhip. It's an awesome pulpy presentation. The sprite work featured here might not be the best of all time, and certainly not the best on the NES, but one aspect that holds up pretty well is how active the game is, for lack of a better word. Almost any individual screen in this game is filled to the brim with detail, interactive elements, and well put together background art. All of this is far better than most of the other 8-bit offerings of the day, with one of the only games topping it being Castlevania 3. What makes all this practically useful to the player is the foreground and background are rendered in such a way that you can never really confuse them. You can tell which sprites are active in the game world and which are just static and or set dressing from a glance. It's also impossible to talk about Castlevania's presentation and aesthetics without the music. Castlevania is famous for its excellent soundtracks across the entire series, and the first game is no exception, featuring some absolute bangers, some of the best featured in a NES game. If I had to rank the top 3 from third to first, I'd say Vampire Killer, Heart of Fire, and Wicked Child make out the best tracks. Getting to the real ambiguous wall meat of the game, is that supposed to be a turkey, chicken or something? The gameplay of Castlevania is akin to that of other side-scrolling platformers of the time. It was the big style back in the day, but where something like Super Mario Bros. Was just about travel to the right of the screen, always moving forward, Castlevania varies how the player makes progress through a level. The player would go up or down staircases to new floors, move backwards from right to left, the traditional left to right, and each level features a mix of all of these, sometimes multiple on the same screen. When pairing this varied progression method with the short interlude cutscenes, there's a decent sense of Simon really just exploring a big castle, as rudimentary as it seems looking back, and admittedly really is. Speaking of progression, the game's levels keep themselves interesting by adding new challenges progressively. The first level has the player contest with the admittedly initially awkward stairs and bottomless pits, the second has Medusa heads and the instant kill roof spikes, the third forcing the player to learn how to time attacks while jumping, and so on. The levels get progressively more demanding of the player's abilities at a steady pace, and it ramps up fairly evenly up until the end. Fairly, because there are two exceptions to this. The infamous level 5 Knight and Medusa hallway is, while able to be exploited, still extremely awkward to pass through without taking damage. That aforementioned exploit leads into one of Castlevania's biggest flaws, but we'll touch on that later. Worse yet is the level 6 bridge, where you have to make tight jumps across a broken series of platforms while dodging giant bats. The real challenge here comes from the erratic, unpredictable movement patterns of the bats. which can just wig out, touch you mid-jump, and lead to your death. We'll expand on this point later, but I'll say this right now. I hate this bridge, and I'm mad about it all of these years later. Story time, boys, and... well, boys, no chick's gonna watch my garbage. But anywho, way back when I was first really getting into the swing of this whole YouTube crap, I did my very first insanely low quality stream trying to beat Castlevania without dying. I always would come close too, every time, but each and every time, without fail, this absolute bastard of a bad bridge would wipe me out. With dozens of runs since then, and live events attempting to do it, and coming just short due to this, I've gotten this irrational sense of anger and anxiety associated with the bridge. I hate it, and even though this year I fucking crushed out my no-death challenge, the raw nonsense that this bridge brings to the game still just boils my blood. Well, now's as good a time as any to delve into Castlevania's combat, which is much more of a focus than the combat is in any other side-scroller of the time. The game has two methods of attack: the whip, which is always on the player, and the interchangeable sub-weapons you can carry one at a time. The whip is the strongest method of attack, but it's limited to only the player's front. While you can crouch and jump to change the elevation, it's static otherwise in this one direction. This is where the sub-weapons come in, which fill the gaps left by the whip. Depending on which sub-weapon you're equipped with, you can attack across the entire screen in an upward angle, create an AoE or freeze time. Overall, I do like the balancing act of the sub-weapons, requiring ammo in the forms of hearts, and filling in for the weaknesses in the otherwise more powerful whip, but the system's not without its flaws. The two biggest issues with them boil down to power scaling and access. Any Castlevania player worth their salt will tell you how, in the first game, holy water is disproportionately strong compared to the rest. It leaves a small area of effect to damage enemies, freezes them during its duration, and with the multiple triple shot upgrade, you can freeze bosses in place, rendering them helpless. Holy water is so good that, with very few exceptions, such as the level 1 boss, you're at a distinct disadvantage when you're not using it. Whenever you get the holy water, you're gonna want to hold on to it until you absolutely must trade it in for something new. This leads into another big issue with the system: random drops. While most sub-weapons reliably drops from set points in a level, which you can memorize and rely on, every now and then an enemy can break your rhythm and drop a new sub-weapon on death, leading you to accidentally walk into it or have it already inside Simon's hitbox before it's too late. So, say you need the level 3 holy water for an upcoming boss fight, but one of these hunchbacks just so happens to drop an axe, resetting your entire progress. You're essentially screwed and have to restart the entire run if you don't know better. Moments and bits of randomization like this lead to a lot of frustration and are emblematic of Castlevania's #1 issue. By design, Castlevania is an extremely rigid game. Your jumps are stiff and momentum can't be changed mid-air. Your attacks have a pause and a set distance, enemies almost all follow a set movement pattern, even the seemingly random ones like Punchback. I could go on. The game is rigid because, for it to work, it simply needs to be. The game's generally fair difficulty curve is due to having set patterns and responses from player character and enemy alike that the player can plan around, and work to their advantage. However, this is only the case most of the time. The moments Castlevania introduces something less structured, such as the Grim Reaper boss fight or the bane of my existence the Bat Bridge, are the moments Castlevania falls in on itself and becomes downright irritating to play. The game has a strict rulebook for like 85% of its runtime, but it's that 15% of less structured challenges that can ruin the experience for some, in my estimation. However, I would still argue that these are just moments. More often than not, Castlevania's difficulty can be managed through pattern recognition and proper planning, due to how predictable the game really is. Most enemies follow a strict movement pattern. Bats move forward, skeletons and knights move in the opposite direction the player does, Medusas have that consistent wave pattern, they always take the same number of hits to defeat, etc. The challenge of Castlevania comes from recognizing these patterns, and with some practice and attention, you can learn all of this and blaze through the supposedly insanely hard game with relative ease. Hell, even if you're a complete loser like I am, you can do it all without dying and pretend that's some sort of accomplishment. The counter-argument to this statement is a simple but accurate one. You can make the same blanket statement for all quote-unquote good game difficulty. Nothing said here is unique, valid, or worthwhile. You could almost say this entire review was an extended waste of time and energy. And to all of that I say, yeah, true enough, but the reason Castlevania really works despite its short length and predictable challenge is how punishing the game is for the slightest misstep. Like many other games at the time, Castlevania was short, but it was hard as nails in a way that rewarded patience, deliberate action, and pattern recognition, rather than dumb luck, which some of the worst NES games did. I understand why some might not appreciate it, but one thing I've always enjoyed about Castlevania was, from the whip delay, to the knockback when hit, to the inability to change momentum while jumping, the game required the player to carefully consider their actions before jumping in all guns blazing. I love me a fast, free flow kind of experience. Hell, I'm a big fan of the first Ninja Gaiden for that reason. But there's something so appealing and interesting to me about an action game with a slower, more carefully considered pace like the first Castlevania. It's extremely gratifying to get to the point where you can run through the game like a master, executing a run near flawlessly due to your own planning and execution. I tried to be a bit more critical in this review due to how close this one is. Castlevania is a childhood game, and if I just listed why I liked it, it would be intellectually dishonest when trying to give a decent, fair stance on it. Make no mistake, Castlevania is a flawed game, and going back to it will no doubt be rough for a lot of people. In the end though, I really just want to try and state my case as to why I do genuinely enjoy Castlevania, and why I'd still say the game holds up overall. And hey, at least it's not a messy waste of time like the remake, right? Right.